Okay.
There's no screen up here though.
Nå, det er. Yes, klar. Hallo, hallo, hallo. Kan I høre, hvad jeg siger? Jeg tror, vi går i gang nu, hvis I kan høre, hvad jeg siger. Hello, my name is Maria. I'm a student at the Master's program in American Studies, and I've been asked to introduce this all-star panel that we have today for our presidential election roundtable. And let me just jump right into it. First, we have Professor of History, David Woolner, who, as we all know now, is basically the go-to person if you want to know anything about Franklin D. Roosevelt. David is a fellow in Roosevelt Studies at Marist College, and he used to be a Fulbright Distinguished Scholar here at SDU. He is basically really great at connecting the dots between history and what's happening in the world today. Next up, we have E.J. Dionne, who is not only a renowned journalist and political commentator, he's also a university professor at Georgetown, a visiting professor at Harvard, and a senior fellow at Brookings Institution. EJ has a knack for breaking down complex political issues with clarity and insight. If there's a debate on where American democracy is headed, you can bet that EJ is right in the middle of it, offering sharp and thoughtful commentary. Plus, he's written several books on politics that are must-reads, so he's definitely a voice you will want to listen to today. Then we have our Danish experts, starting with Niels Bjerre-poulsen, SDU's very own historian on American politics. Niels has a PhD in American history from the University of California, Santa Barbara, so he knows his way around American politics and history better than most Americans that I know, probably. His research dives deep into US political history, American culture, the presidency, and foreign relations. This might sound like a lot, but if anyone can juggle all of this, it's Niels. He's done over 1,500 interviews on Danish radio and TV, and he's also working on several books right now. So he's so busy, he probably wrote a book right before we started this conversation. And case in point, he has to leave at 2 o'clock because he's talking somewhere else because he's, sought after. And then finally, we have Professor Jørn Brøndal. Now, if you've managed to turn on the television or radio in Denmark in the last couple of weeks without seeing Jørn, congratulations. This is rare. He's everywhere at the moment, and for good reason. He's the chair of the Center for American Studies, and you can see him being interviewed everywhere about his takes on the latest polling in battleground states to what pet is on the menu in Ohio this week. He talks about all of it. And he can put on a PowerPoint presentation and draw a US map like nobody's business. So with this dream team, we got all the angles covered. And welcome to the roundtable.
So let me start off. Can you hear me? Oh, do we need a mic?
Yes.
Oh. Can you hear me? I had this professor in Santa Barbara who had a voice impairment, so he was always wearing a mic. And every day he would start by saying, I will now continue my story. No, joking aside, next month, one of the speakers we will have visiting here is Nicole Hemmer, who wrote a book recently called Partisans, how the party of Reagan became the party of Trump. And I'm going to talk about how the Democratic Party became the party of Reagan instead. At least if you looked at the Democratic National Convention. I think one of the most striking things, if you look at Democratic strategy in this election, is how they have managed to take many of the symbols and mannerisms that used to be associated with the Republican Party, at least the Republican Party of the 1980s. Reagan's Morning Again in America, America as a shining city upon a hill, Kamala Harris's story about, the American dream is still alive. This is the country where the daughter of two immigrants can become president of the United States. And I think that has largely been made possible by the fact that Trump's, I don't know how to characterize what is driving him, but the way in which he has made American success entirely dependent on whether he's elected or not. This idea that basically the US is a third world country, or it will cease to exist, or it will be Venezuela on steroids, or it won't be a country unless he's elected. He has made the American dream, the idea of America, wholly dependent on whether or not he's elected. And I think that has opened up a large space for the Democrats in this election. I was struck the other day when I saw the New York Times endorsement of Kamala Harris. It said the only patriotic choice. I don't think you would have seen that some years ago. Democrats would have been more focused on rights or things that had to be sort of made up for or in some way compensated for, or they would talk about it as a project in development. But listening to Kamala Harris at the Democratic National Convention, talking about the greatest, what was the phrase? The greatest honor you could have was to be called an American. That, I think, is a vocabulary that is somewhat different from what you would usually see. The same with you always have the flags, but this time around, the cowboy hats, the USA, 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 and so on. So I think there's clearly something interesting going on here. Now, Reagan, as I mentioned, has been described by George Will, one of the conservative commentators in the US, who, by the way, is actually supporting Kamala Harris now, has been described as the man who presented America to what he called conservatism without tears. If you went back, conservatives in the 1960s and 70s were mostly against things. Barry Goldwater, who was the Republican candidate in 1964, famously said, "I'm not coming to Washington to pass laws, I'm coming to repeal them." So that was sort of a different attitude. And Reagan was the one who could sort of present a positive, coherent, conservative, I don't know if coherent is probably not the right word, but a positive conservative agenda in a way that had sort of escaped conservatives perhaps before him. And I think that's the kind of optimism that the Harris campaign is trying to bring back. And I think when Joe Biden was the candidate, he was slightly handicapped by this idea that his message was largely, okay, I'm old, but the other guy is a threat to democracy. And it was sort of, he was not wrong, but it was a fairly gloomy message. And I think somehow the Harris campaign, by embracing freedom as a theme, is trying to present a much more upbeat message for voters who are still on the fence for one reason or another. And I think if you look at the election of Tim Walz as a vice presidential candidate, he has really added to that if there was a danger that Kamala Harris would be, described as a San Francisco liberal that was sort of part of an elite that didn't care for ordinary Americans, picking Tim Walz, born in a small town in Nebraska with 400 inhabitants, joining the National Guard at the age of 17 and so on, becoming a school teacher, that whole story, and then turning small town America into the place where you actually find tolerance. This idea that, here in Minnesota, we have a saying, mind your own damn business. And, we care for each other, but we're not judgmental in how we treat our neighbors and so on. I think that is clearly a deliberate strategy, but something that he does very well, and something that I think perhaps might actually work. I mean, it's still close, but I think it's a smart move away from only talking about the doom and gloom of think about what happens if Donald Trump wins the election. So I think that's largely my pitch, and I'll pass it on to who? To you, Jørn? To EJ? Who wants to?
Well, what you want me to? I want to go next just to say how right you are. And then make a, I wanted to. I think I'm going to go up there because I've got my little slide. Yeah. First of all, thanks to everybody for sticking with us in finding this room. When we were walking here, I had no idea where I was going, and I thought I'd end up in Copenhagen, but I actually, thanks to wise guidance, I love to talk with numbers, as those of you who were here yesterday know, so I have a few, and I wanted to talk mostly about religion's role in this election with a little touching on class. But I just want to underscore what Niels said, because I think it's really important. I think Democrats have tried to do this before. And funnily enough, Biden himself ended practically every speech he's given as president with this patriotic pitch that there's nothing that Americans can't accomplish when they come together. But partly because he's older and partly because that was raised all the time, Harris actually can do it better and with more enthusiasm and particularly more reach to younger voters. And I was at the Democratic convention, and the shouts of USA, USA popped up without any excuse at all. And there were USA signs all over the place. And I do think that redefining freedom as a democratic cause and also expanding it, not just freedom from state interference, as in the reproductive rights issue, but also the ways in which government can enhance people's freedom. For example, here in Denmark, by giving all of you grants to go to university. And so I think that this combination of freedom from, freedom to is very much part of their pitch. And I do think it's more effective. What I wanted to talk about, America has been historically a very religious country. There are a lot of reasons for that. Partly, I think, one of the reasons that people don't talk about is that we're an immigrant country, and that for many who immigrated to the United States from all over the world, religion and ties to religion was often a way to transition to being American, but holding on to something very important from the culture from which they came. I think this was especially important for Catholics immigrating to a predominantly Protestant country, beginning with the Irish and moving through all sorts of other groups, Italians, my French Canadians, Poles, and others. It's true now. An Indian American friend once said, I never felt so Hindu until I came to America, because identifying and connecting with the Hindu past was a way, the Hindu family past, was a way to maintain a loyalty to his Indian identity while also having a loyalty to his American identity. With Catholics, historically, Catholics were democratic on the whole for two reasons. One is Democrats, even back in their days as racists and pro-slavery, were more open to immigrants for a variety of reasons. But then later on in the Roosevelt era, which David could tell us about, they were working class, and Roosevelt became the hero of the working class. And so one of my favorite jokes about religion in the United States is about Mrs. O'Reilly, obviously an Irish name, being driven to the polls by her son. Her son has become an independent. He votes for a lot of Republicans. He's well off, but he knows his mom is a Democrat, but he still takes her to vote. And he says to her one day, "How are you going to vote, Mom?" And she says, "Straight Democratic," which is the way you say, "I'm going to vote for every Democrat for every office on the ballot." And the son says to her, "But you know, Mom, if Jesus came back to earth and ran as a Republican, you'd vote against it." And Mrs. O'Reilly looked at her son and said, "Oh, hush. Why should he change his party after all these years?" And this was, and now the thing that's happened in American politics is a bunch of people think Jesus has changed his party after all these years. And so you will see some numbers up there. It's not true that because white evangelical Christians have become such a powerful constituency for Donald Trump, it's assumed that religion and Christianity live entirely on the right in American politics. A couple of things about the white evangelicals: their loyalty to the Republicans began long before Donald Trump. If you look at the difference between Mitt Romney's share of white evangelicals and Donald Trump's share, it's only about 3 percentage points. Mitt Romney won them by almost as much as Trump did. George W. Bush was very strongly supported by the evangelicals. So this is more continuity than it is change, even if for some evangelicals, Trump's behavior might give them pause. But I think their view that Trump stands up for them against the secular enemy is more important than anything about Trump's behavior. Indeed, within white evangelical circles, there are biblical arguments that say that Trump is really like Cyrus of Persia. He may not be one of us, but he protects our worldview. And so on my little chart, indeed, white evangelicals are voting overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. White non-evangelicals, so that's every other kind of Protestants, every other kind of Protestant, including Lutherans and other Episcopalians, Presbyterians, all the other Methodists. It's much closer. Trump still has a lead among white non-evangelicals, but it's much narrower than among white evangelicals. And then Black Protestants are among the most religious people in the United States, measured by what they say about their faith, their attendance at religious services. And so if you want to say all religious Christians are Republican, well, you've never been inside a Black church. It's fascinating to compare what happens inside a Black church versus a white evangelical church. In the Black church, you are much more likely to hear talk about Exodus and liberation than you will in the white evangelical church. You're much more likely to hear Jesus preaching the Beatitudes than you will in the white evangelical church. You're much more likely to hear stories of personal salvation. So there's something, in a sense, more collective in the Black version of the version of Christianity in the Black churches, and they are overwhelmingly Democratic. The Catholic vote, I've said many times that there is no Catholic vote, and it's important. There is no Catholic vote now in the sense that Catholics are very divided. They are classically a 40-40-20 group, 40 on one side, 40 on the other, and a big swing. They are also very diverse, and as you will see here, there is a big difference between white Catholics who are voting quite strongly for Trump and Latino Catholics who are voting quite strongly for Kamala Harris. Within the Latino community, as my colleague who spoke earlier said, there is quite a big difference among evangelical Latinos, Catholic Latinos, and non-believing Latinos or non-religiously engaged. They're not on this chart, but that the Catholic Latinos are more Democratic. The evangelical Latinos are the heart of Trump's support in the Latino community. Muslims are not on this chart, but American Jews and American Muslims vote almost about the same. We'll see what happens in this election with Gaza and the controversy over Gaza. But the American Jews and American Muslims are both about 2-to-1 Democratic. But the most important thing that's happened to religious sociology in America in the last 20 years is the rise of the religiously unaffiliated. I think I may have mentioned that in my talk yesterday, particularly among young people. Pollsters call them the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, because if you ask the question, do you belong to a religious tradition, or what religion are you, they will reply none. It doesn't mean they're not spiritual. They might have spiritual commitments, but they do not belong to an organized religion. And they are one of the most democratic groups in the country, as you will see at the bottom of this little chart. People who call themselves atheists are overwhelmingly democratic, agnostics about the same. And if you say nothing in particular, you are also very strongly democratic. This creates very interesting coalition management problems for Democrats, which I think Harris is doing pretty well at dealing with. She's Baptist. She speaks openly about her faith. But Democrats include the most religious people in the country, who are, by at least sociologically, Black Americans, and the least religious people in the country. And then this whole array of other groups, because at this moment, immigrants from Asia and Jews and Muslims are all somewhat more democratic. But I think Harris has wisely made the choice that, as a scholar told me the other day, who wrote a book on the rise of secularism, secular voters don't mind candidates speaking in religious terms. They just don't want government interfering with religion. And that's clearly what Harris has come to. This is just a quick chart that I added here. You can tell on the whole that if you are more religiously engaged, you're likely to be a little more Republican. If you look at the number for all Christians at the top, there's one, it doesn't make any difference for Black Protestants at all. It shows the loyalty of Black voters to the Democratic Party. What's fascinating is, and I want to get more explanation for this, white Protestants who attend church more often are the one group there that is more democratic than people who attend church less. And that is something I cannot explain to you, because that's the one group that breaks. So I think it's important, when you hear a lot of talk about religion in the United States, to understand that the American religious landscape is a lot more than white evangelicals. The Christian landscape is a lot more than white evangelicals. But religion is important, but it's complicated. Last thing I just want to put on the table, because, well, two things I want to put on the table. One is, as you think about this agenda, almost nothing we talk about may be as important as gender. This is not up there. This is just the next slide. Well, this has it here, but this is a poll earlier this month that showed the race basically tied. You can see the gender gap here. There was a poll that came out yesterday that showed this gender gap is widening. And this poll yesterday showed that Donald Trump led Kamala Harris by 16 points among men. And Kamala Harris led Donald Trump by 18 points among women. If anything like that happens on election day, we have never seen a gender gap of this size in American politics. And if Harris wins, you can really say American women put Kamala Harris in the White House. And if Trump pulls this out somehow, you could say that American men put him in the White House. And I think that has fascinating implications across a whole series of issues. The last thing I just want to call to your attention is the complexity of class in American politics. And these days, because a lot of people people who might be called working class are not in traditional industrial occupations anymore, we use education as an imperfect measure of class. And you've really seen an inversion of education, of class as a political measure. In the past, the working class was Democratic, the upper class was Republican. And that applied for a long period in American politics. You could probably see that through at least the first Clinton election in 1992, but certainly before that. Now it's the other way around. Those PhDs are really big Democrats. If you see people with postgraduate education are overwhelmingly for Harris. College grads are for Harris, and this includes everyone of all races. Those who attended college but did not graduate are closely split, and those who never went to university are 55-42 for Trump. As you watch our election, I think the dynamic here is if Harris is to win, she's got to cut into Obama. She's got to cut into Trump's advantage among working class voters. She won't win them, but she has to get some of them back, both white working class voters and Latino working class voters. And that's to return to your brilliant colleague, my now new brilliant colleague, Niels. I think that is very much where these appeals to patriotism and Tim Walz's presence on the ticket is very important. I'll leave you with this. I suggest that you look at YouTube and find the most, I've never seen an ad like this in an American election in my life. Among the various aspects of Tim Walz, one of them is he likes to tinker with car engines. He's a car guy, and he likes to fix car engines. And there are a lot of guys in the United States who like to tinker with cars. And so if you start looking at the ad, it's Tim Walz with a car engine in front of him in an old car, actually teaching a lesson on how to fix this car. And in the middle of it, he analogizes fixing a car to the issues before the election. So what looks like a post from Car and Driver magazine or something like that to teach you about cars is interspersed with the messaging that they want in the election. I have no idea how many people will see that ad, but I think that ad tells you a lot about how the Harris-Walz campaign sees the dynamics of the election, and they agree with Niels. So thank you very much.
I think David should go next because Niels can always let me talk. So.
Yeah.
I don't. Microphone.
It's a privilege every time.
Hello?
He has one of those faces for television. I'm not surprised. He's on TV all the time. I was born with a face made for radio.
Well, I have a couple of observations to make about the comments that were just made.
Yeah.
It's working. You can hear me all right. I don't need to scream into this thing. One is that my wife is a Filipino woman who was born in the Philippines, came to the United States at the age of 14. Doesn't really, not really, basically grew up in the United States and didn't really feel like an immigrant until 2016 with that election. The other thing I would say is that the American flag for my wife is something she's afraid of. When she sees an American flag, she's fearful because that to her represents the constituency that's supporting Donald Trump, and the sort of she sees it as a resurgence of racial animosity towards her, towards people that are immigrants, which she never felt she was an immigrant until now. So this is very interesting that the Democratic Party is picking up this theme. And she's actually said to me, she's upset because she said they stole the flag. She really feels that the flag is stolen. We live in upstate New York, which is a fairly liberal area, although there are Republicans, and the rural New York, like much of rural America, is very, very conservative, actually. But a pickup truck with an American flag is something she's afraid of. And so I think that's something to consider. And the other thing I would consider, and by the way, Michael Barone, I published a book on Roosevelt and Catholicism. He called Roosevelt a Protestant patrician in a Catholic party, which I think is a great line. The other thing I was going to say, though, is that when we were talking before, I thought, well, since I'm the Roosevelt guy, I got to introduce Roosevelt's voice in here somehow. And there's two things I'd like to say. One is yesterday in my talk, he said, as for democracy, it cannot succeed unless those who are prepared to choose or express their choice are prepared to choose wisely. As such, he said, the real safeguard of democracy is education, which I think is obviously a very important point. But the second thing I'd like to say is, and this kind of is more broad, or I'm speaking more in broad terms here. On April 11th, 1945, Roosevelt was sitting in the back porch in the sunshine of his cottage in Warm Springs, Georgia. And he was working basically on the last speech he would ever write. It was a Jefferson Day radio address that he was planning to give in a few days' time. And one of the last things he wrote was, if civilization is to survive, we must cultivate the science of human relationships, the ability of all peoples of all kinds to live together in the same world at peace. And of course, he was actually referring to the war, Second World War, when he was talking about this, eliminating the scourge of war. And he talks about Thomas Jefferson being a scientist and the scientific community being linked together around the world, you know, as a sort of a common denominator. But one of the things that came up yesterday, and I think it's a little bit lacking in some respects from our conversations, is the culture wars. You know, so much of this, we talk in the United States about people voting against their own interests, particularly among working class white individuals. And in my lifetime, you know, I have seen that shift take place from a constituency that was largely Democratic. It was sort of Rooseveltian Democrats who would, working class people who would tinker with cars, and they would vote consistently Democratic. Some of them might belong to unions and so forth, to a constituency that's very anti-elite, feels as if the government has no interest in them at all, that they're being overlooked, and is very, how do I put this? I don't, you know, I want to be careful here, but it's very uncomfortable with liberals, and now liberals call themselves progressives, but the word liberal was purposely denigrated by a lot of right-wing commentators, telling them how to think, you know, what values they should embrace, whether it's gay marriage, issues of gender, these kinds of things that are very personal issues among families in rural communities who may be religious and so forth. And I think one of the big challenges for us, and I wouldn't even just say Democrats, I would say the society as a whole, is, you know, the question was asked in the last session, how do you change the worldview of these people? You know, Roosevelt was brilliant at this. He would quote Catholic doctrine quite consistently in his speeches. He used a lot of messaging to try to link himself and Catholic social teaching to reach out to people and send these messages. And, you know, in a country where somebody feels threatened by the American flag, or where people just shut off, they refuse to believe that climate change is real, or, you know, or they feel hostile towards what they consider a liberal elite, telling them how to think and how to worship and you know, how they should view issues like marriage. That's a big challenge, I think. And that's where we have a kind of a wall that you run into. You know, we talk about this inability of the two sides to speak to one another about a different worldview. I think the biggest challenge really is how to shift those worldviews, or make possible a dialogue between these two opposing polarized points of view in the United States, and turn it into something constructive, because there is such a sharp division between the two sides in that sense. So those are my questions, actually. You know, I don't really know if I have the answer to that question, but it struck me that, you know, rallying around the flag and shouting USA, that's very refreshing for me to hear that, because of what my wife has been saying, you know, that she feels that somehow the flag is something that she's afraid of, but hopefully that won't last.
Could I make one quick intervention? Because I do think the cultural issues are very important and explain those religion numbers. But for those who think that people are unchangeable on these things, I'm sort of feel, I told you that in my talk yesterday, I'm addicted to hope, you know, and so I just want to make one point about an issue, which is same-sex marriage. The change in the United States around the issue of same-sex marriage, I don't think we're alone in this in the world, is truly breathtaking. Gallup, the great venerable polling organization, has been polling on this for a long time. As recently as August of 2005, so that's 19 years ago, only 37% of Americans said that same-sex marriage should be recognized as valid with the same rights as traditional marriage. Today, 69% of Americans support same-sex marriage. That's an extraordinary change, 37 to 69. I think a lot of that change is owed to the fact that lots of gay and lesbian people, LGBTQ people have come out, and Americans have discovered, whatever their views, that someone they really care about, a child, a cousin, a nephew, a friend, dear friend, is gay or lesbian. But that is a remarkable change. And I just want to put on the table that we shouldn't think ever that we are frozen in one place, and that I love that Churchill line about Americans making a lot of mistakes and then doing the right thing, because I think you can find on some questions that that's true. I don't think David disagrees with me on that, but I do like to introduce that element. Niels, you wanted to come back?
I just wanted to add, it's worth remembering that when Barack Obama ran for president in 2008, he didn't want to support gay marriage.
Correct.
He ran on civil unions, and actually, that's around that time you really began to see the shift. And in many ways, Joe Biden was ahead of him on that election. So
it annoyed Obama that Joe Biden came out before him. It supported same-sex.
Was that 2011 where he said it was a big fucking deal? You know,
he said that about the healthcare bill.
Oh yeah. But he said something similar about when the Supreme Court decision came down. So.
Yep.
Okay, but let's just give David a round of applause.
Yeah. I'm so excited by the talk. I jumped right in and let you get the applause.
I might also add that in at the Republican convention in 1992, Pat Buchanan went on a rant against homosexuals and claimed that the homosexual party was a party of the Democrats. It was absolutely disgusting, and it's incredible to hear it today. Anyway, I'm going to talk about polarization and the Cold Civil War. I have a piece in Dagbladet-Politiken, the Danish newspaper, on Saturday that's been accepted about this, and I've basically translated my piece into English. So this will be a no-slide little talk. A Cold War is raging in the United States. The Americans don't shoot at each other for the most part, but the political debate has broken down across the middle. Republican Donald Trump dismisses his political opponents as Marxists, communists, fascists, and vermin. The Democratic rhetoric is not quite as extreme still. Kamala Harris compares Trump to a common criminal and warns of the consequences for democracy if he's re-elected. The Cold Civil War is a result of a polarization process that has been going on since at least the 1960s and has now reached new heights. The 1960s witnessed not only assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Robert F. Kennedy, which all shook the nation. The decade is also identified with both King's civil rights movement, with Malcolm X's violent, or at least controversial rhetoric, with Black Power, with uprisings in the inner cities, with student uprisings and protests against the war in Vietnam, and with the fight for the rights of women, for homosexuals, and for the indigenous population towards the end of the decade. The decade created an opener and more inclusive United States, but it also left a smoldering bitterness. The culmination in 1968 ended not in revolution, but in the election of the Republican Richard Nixon to the presidency, a politician who spoke right into the resentment and anger when from 1969, he began to appeal to America's silent majority. With the Berlin Wall coming down in 1989, polarization got another boost. No longer having a common enemy to fight against, communism, there was room for internal bickering. A number of Republican politicians led by the combative and creative Newt Gingrich of Georgia discovered that political stubbornness and not giving a hoot about compromise paid off with voters. The fighting spirit was further enhanced by gerrymandering based on microanalysis of voter behavior, in which the party in power in a state tried to tailor congressional districts in such a way as to optimize its own outcome. As Barack Obama once stated, the politicians chose their voters. The congressional districts thereby became ideologically purer and more uncompromising, and that became a virtue. The mass media also became more polarized. In 1987, the Federal Communications Commission, which regulates radio and television communications across the states, repealed the so-called fairness doctrine. This had demanded that controversial political topics be illuminated from both sides. Now the way was paved for politically one-sided news coverage. Initially with the flourishing of conservative talk radio, then in 1996 with the establishment of cable television channels like Fox News on the right and MSNBC, which soon turned left. When you turn on these stations today, you experience the incredible phenomenon of aggressive journalists playing politicians and preaching positions. The establishment of the social media sites, Facebook and Twitter, only strengthened polarization through algorithms that tended to radicalize people. Today, many Americans move around in echo chambers that support their views and where basic facts are up for debate. This forms the background for the disturbing phenomenon that, according to a poll from the beginning of 2024, only 31% of Republican voters perceive Joe Biden as the legitimate president. Only 31%, less than 1/3. Most party members have swallowed the alternative facts, as Kellyanne Conway once called them, that completely baselessly suggest that Trump won the election. Americans have become so polarized since the turn of the millennium that they have begun to participate in what the journalist Bill Bishop has called the big sort. When Americans changed residence, many moved to counties where one political party dominates by at least 20 percentage point down to the other. According to Bishop, 1 in 4 Americans lived in such landslide counties in 1976. Today, it's almost 60%. On an even deeper level, old ethnic and racial tensions still lurk. For the most part, they bubble under a veneer of political correctness, which the right wing repeatedly attacks, even though the alternative to political correctness, historically speaking, has been ethnic chauvinism and gross racism. From time to time, tensions break out, most significantly in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter movement and its massive protests in the wake of the police killing of African-American George Floyd. More conflicts are in store as the United States demographically changes face due to extensive migration. The Cold War manifests itself in the fact that controversial political positions that previously did not always have a razor-sharp partisan political edge now do have it. Today, most abortion opponents belong to the Republican Party, and most supporters of free abortion are Democrats. It wasn't always like that. Of the 7 Supreme Court justices who in 1973 voted to introduce free abortion in Roe v. Wade, 4 were nominated by Republicans, 3 by Democratic presidents. The partisan lines in other debates on controversial issues have also become clearer in recent years on the issue of migration, on firearms, on crime. On the other hand, the fight about the past, about slavery, and about the Civil War has long followed party lines. The trend toward ideologically more refined parties is disturbing. In an ethnically diverse nation with 340 million inhabitants and only 2 political parties to choose from, the parties have to show a certain level of ideological elasticity, and the politicians must show respect for each other and for the rules of democracy. If the parties are too rigid and too hostile towards each other, the nation breaks down across the middle. The Cold War is thus the result of large tectonic plates moving. Nevertheless, concrete politicians bear considerable responsibility for the collapse of the political debate. The main responsibility lies with Trump and the Republicans. Even though many leading Democrats, like so many other politicians, are wont to be opportunists who may easily embellish the truth in the service of their political cause, the Republicans under Trump have moved in an extreme direction where crass political manipulation and outright falsehoods have become weapons, most blatantly by Trump himself with his big lie about winning the 2020 election. Trump's is also the party that has fundamentally changed character after a significant purge of the old elite. The US has already reached the point where the mere fact that Harris walked up to Trump before their televised duel and shook his hand was extraordinary. Numerous analysts interpret this action solely from tactical angles, as if shaking hands were no longer part of a common type of political decency. The level of conflict will presumably only escalate going forward toward November 5th. Don't expect either necessarily any resolution on election day. A cold war is raging, a cold civil war is raging in the United States. Thank you.
Well, there you have it.
Right. But now, basically, there's time for Q&A. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think that's an excellent analysis. Cold Civil War is something we are talking about a lot in the country. And if you note, yesterday I mentioned the most important election since 1860. You'll also recall that our hot Civil War began after 1860, and I think that's part of it. One of the things I think is interesting about this election is that Harris has decided to run against the Cold Civil War and against the division, and that she has chosen to run as the "we have more in common than divides us" candidate. And I think that she is trying to harness a majority, and it won't be a huge majority because we are so polarized, but she is trying to harness a majority out of people who are sick and tired of how polarized and angry we are. Now, if she did that, whether she will be able to change the mood, we don't know, although I think a second defeat for Trump might be the beginning of a steps toward that, but we'll see. But I think that's an excellent analysis. Can you allow me a question to the entire audience before we go? And then you should ask us. I want to poll this audience, and I want to give you 3 choices, just so you know. You'll have a bailout option if you want it. I'd be very curious who hopes that Harris wins, who hopes that Trump wins, and who wants to give the Tim Walz "none of my damn business" answer. Who hopes that Harris wins our election? She should hold the election in this room. Who hopes that Trump wins the election? Am I correct that not a single hand is up? Please don't be intimidated if you are on the other side of this. Anybody take the "none of my damn business" option? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So everyone but 5. Thank you. I will carry that home with me. I do think you're reflective of a lot of polling in Europe about the election, but thank you for answering my question. Now we will be happy to answer yours. Please. Somebody must disagree with us on something.
Well, I think that
I want to switch. Any student want to please jump? There you go.
Yeah, so you talked about this polarization within the country, and it seemed like with the great quote from Roosevelt that education would be the answer. But what is the troubles with creating this national degree of education and without the own state's autonomy, and maybe changing the only also like grade school education, right? So like that all Americans would have maybe the same basis of facts. Does it make sense? Like what obstacles is there for national-wide, like common education as opposed to the state's own autonomy within the educational system?
Okay, well, basically, in the United States, schools are locally based, and they do receive federal funds since the jobs in the 60s, but they're locally based, and therefore, and we're dealing with 50 different states with each profile. Thank you. Thanks a lot. And therefore, basically, changing that would be almost impossible. And I also think that lots and lots and lots and lots of local school board members would identify that kind of change as the deep state acting.
This is the fact that education is a local responsibility in the United States is a big deal, is a big part of the issue. So that also leads to the financing of our public education system, which is a real problem. Because you have wealthy areas of the country that can put a lot more money into their schools than poorer areas. The federal aid is mainly designed to counter some of that. That the federal aid goes much more into, but not entirely, but more into poorer districts. In some of the more progressive states, the states top up spending in some of the poorer districts. But the education issue is a big kind of subterranean issue in our politics. It plays into the culture wars to some degree because of splits about what books should be in school libraries as well as public libraries, what values should be taught in the schools. But it's also a policy issue where, on the whole, Democrats have been more for redistribution of resources among schools, but we are, in my view, a long way from doing some of what we need to do to create a greater sense of educational equality. And I think what's interesting is Harris is running to create an opportunity economy. That's her kind of catchphrase, which I think is interesting because it's on the one hand, it does not sound like a left-wing position. It's saying, I want people to become entrepreneurs and start their own businesses and sort of take care of themselves. Yet it has a progressive underpinning because how do you create equality of opportunity? And it requires significant intervention. If she were elected, I'm curious where she would take that on the education question. I think it has a lot of implications for your question.
Other questions?
Please. Wait, over here. Why don't you start as the mic goes your way?
I don't exactly remember what day it was. A couple days ago, the Danish Prime Minister held her traditional speech at the opening of our state. But in this speech, she talked about how it's a privilege to be talking and discussing a lot of social issues, and I couldn't help but to apply this to the United States, where a lot of social issues such as transidentity, LGBTQ issues, the issue of abortion is very much prominent. But I couldn't help but to feel that it's not so much privilege in the US, but more so wanting to escape from the actual issues in the United States. And I wanted to hear if any of you reflect in this idea that the focus on American social issues is more of a form of escapism from the actual issues in the United States. Mostly economics, mostly workers' rights. The longshoremen have recently gone on strike, and we don't know if they're actually going to get their needs, if they're going to get this, I believe it was some 70 to 80% wage increase, and I have not heard any politician even like acknowledge it.
Could I know David wanted to.
No, go ahead.
I very much agree with what you're saying. I do think social issues are real issues. Obviously, the fight over abortion rights is a real issue. The fight over LGBTQ rights is a real issue. So I think we shouldn't say they're unreal, but fight over immigration is a real issue. But I agree with you that particularly on the right, these can be used as a distraction from arguing about economic inequality and economic opportunity. And I wrote this in a column about the Vance-Walz debate because it was very interesting that when housing came up, Vance immediately went to, said illegal aliens are the cause of the housing problem in the United States because they're taking apartments, basically taking apartments away from the native born. And that is, to me, a great evasion. I mean, it's demagogic in my view, but it's also a great evasion of the fact that we need to build more houses. And ironically, about a third of the construction industry is made up of immigrants. So if you actually stopped immigration, you would probably get in the way of building more housing, which we need. So I do think that there is a struggle to make economics more important. And I think there are a handful of kind of libertarian Republicans who would love to argue about economics and make a case for the free market and less government. But I think that mostly it's progressives who would like economic issues to play a larger role in the election. And if you look at Harris's advertising, a lot of it is about economic, there's a lot about abortion because her position is popular. but there's an awful lot about basic economic opportunity issues, and I think she's trying to press that, and I think she sees, as I mentioned earlier, that those issues can let her cut into the Trump vote among working class voters, and we'll see. And obviously, Democrats are also very vocal in support of unions. Joe Biden is, if you look at his record, including what regulatory changes the government has made, he really is the most pro-union president since Franklin Roosevelt. Yeah. And this is where I pass the baton to David.
Well, no, I would just agree.
You would disagree with
no, I would agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you know, she's trying to cut into to the perception that somehow Trump is better for the economy than the Democrats, and I think she is gaining traction on that front, and I think the whole opportunity agenda is a very clever way to do that. So we'll see how that goes, but things have definitely slowed in terms of her building up momentum. So, but the longshoreman strike being put on hold was very important news this morning.
It really was very important, because if that strike had continued, it would have raised the specter of inflation again. And I'd love to know what was said in those rooms, because I can just imagine President Biden saying, if you guys go out now, you may help elect Donald Trump. And do you really, really, really want to do that? But I have no idea if he said that, but I'd be surprised if he didn't say something like that. But,
yeah, I mean, again, if we go back to the Clinton campaign in 1992, James Carville, it's the economy, stupid. And even today, the economy does play a significant role. I mean, if we talk about the three main issues that are going to be determinative for the electoral outcome, it would seem that it's going to be discussions about inflation, going to be the Mexican border, and it's going to be abortion. Those are the three main issues. There are many others, and I mean, we've framed this as if we're dealing with the future of American democracy, and that is incredibly important. But to many American voters, I think that those three issues are the determinative. What's really unfortunate is that the level at which the economy is being debated among the Republicans is that they claim that the Democratic administration of Biden has been a disaster, even though many economic figures don't seem to add up to that being the case. But with, I think it was you, EJ, who yesterday talked about that. I mean, even when you have even if the inflation ends, it's not as if the prices go down on gas again. They'll stay up, but then everything else will catch up with it. But I mean, I do think that the economy plays a massive role. The problem is not so much that it's not being discussed as that it's been discussed, I find, at least from the one side, in a very primitive way.
I'm going to continue my quest. We gave you a panel of all guys. We can't have all guys' voices in this. So somebody else jump in, please. Go ahead in the back there. We got.
Yeah, I was just curious what you all think you think of both of the vice presidential nominees. Why did they pick Walz and JD Vance?
Oh, that's a great question. We'll take Walz. Walz was the dark horse, to the American term for a horse that wins a race when people didn't expect that horse to win. He was not at the top of anyone's list when she started. I think there are a couple of reasons why. One is, in the period from the time Biden dropped out to the time Harris made her choice, there were lots of interviews done with a lot of the potential candidates. It was almost like an election contest without an election, and they were all playing Harris. And I think Walz, among them all, was one of the most effective. I think in that period, the two most effective in framing messages that Harris would want to use were Walz and Pete Buttigieg, the Secretary of Transportation. And then Walz, and then secondly, I think it goes to your Niels's point really about Walz coming from Middle America as opposed to the coasts and speaking the language of Middle America. A very progressive governor. His record was extremely progressive, but he was very much a small town Midwestern guy, born in Nebraska, moves to Minnesota. And thirdly, I think one of the main alternatives to Waltz is a very effective governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, who's somebody to keep your eye on. He is really, even though he is an ardent fan of the Philadelphia 76ers, and I'm an ardent fan of the Boston Celtics, and I love him because the first time I interviewed him, he looked at me and said, "You just have to know I hate your Celtics," because these two teams are two of the archest rivals in the country. Anyway, he's somebody to watch. He's very smart. But Waltz was particularly, Shapiro was particularly outspoken on the Gaza conflict. And she, I think, even though no one will admit this in the campaign, I think they decided they just did not need that fight at the convention or in the party. I have a feeling that was part of it, but I also have a feeling that putting that aside, even if that was not the reason, I also think that Waltz, coming from the Midwest, not being an Ivy League sounding kind of guy, was part of it. For J.D. Vance, it does appear that Trump's kids intervened. That he, according to the news reports, he leaned to Governor Burgum of North Dakota, who was not an exciting candidate, certainly a safe candidate, a business guy. And I think Trump liked a business guy on the ticket. But Trump's kids saw J.D. Vance as dynamic and a potential leader of the Trump movement after Trump. And I think that is why Trump picked him. And I think he showed in that debate that he was quite skillful. I thought it was he was very evasive as well. But evasion in a debate is a skill. And I think that was what his kids saw in him. I think he had grave doubts about whether that was the right thing early on, when all these statements Vance had made about women and cat ladies and all that came out. I think after the debate, he may feel a little better, although Trump was probably secretly very upset that a lot of people said Vance debates way better than Trump does.
As the sole Minnesotan in the room, I'm from Minnesota, and I feel very at home in Scandinavia. I consider myself at 6'3" average height, by the way. I think Waltz, I was very pleasantly surprised, and I thought it was a good move. And, I don't live in the Midwest anymore, but there is a kind of a value system that runs right from Minnesota through Iowa and to parts of the Dakotas and somewhat parts of Wisconsin, that I think it's a constituency that by picking Waltz, she can move the needle, and perhaps this is going to make Wisconsin go the way that Harris wants. I don't have much to say about Vance so much because I agree with EJ. I'm actually kind of worried about Vance. One doesn't want to think about a successor to Donald Trump because what my hope, and I had said this a long time ago to another political commentator by the name of David Gergen, I happened to meet. This is in 2004. I said, "Don't you think the only thing that will save the United States is the liberalization of the Republican Party?" And he said, "Yeah, but they're going to have to lose and lose badly." And this is a man, by the way, who worked for both sides. He was very much a centrist politician and very highly respected by moderate Republicans as well as Democrats. And when Trump ran, I thought that would be the end of that would fulfill my prophecy, right? And quite the opposite has happened, which is why I see it as such a challenge and why I feel sometimes I don't really have an answer. Your question about education is absolutely right. But the question then is, how do you communicate civic responsibility and respect for the rule of law to a generation or to a group of people that's willing to just kind of look the other way? And that's where I kind of run into a roadblock.
One of the things about Waltz, and I thought this is what David was going to say when he began, which is that there is a direct line from Scandinavia to the upper Midwest of the United States. And that's not only because people from Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland emigrated there. It's also that they influence their politics. If you look historically, they may be, in a broad sense, the most social democratic sorts of states in the Union. And the other appeal of Waltz is that if you go back and look, there is last year, the Minnesota legislature passed one of the most broadly progressive programs of any state in the union. They called it the Minnesota Miracle. I interviewed Waltz back then and to talk about this. And it's really remarkable how much progress on a whole series of issues, including education, by the way, that the state made. And that appealed to a lot of people on the progressive side of the Democratic Party.
May I just add, I wrote a book back in 2004 called Ethnic Leadership and Midwestern Politics, in which I discuss how Scandinavians joined the progressive movement of Robert La Follette in Wisconsin. It was my dissertation turned into a book. But to return to the vice presidential debate, isn't it funny how this presidential election cycle seems to revolve around cat women and eating cats and dogs? I mean, but you know, but to speak, just one final comment on the vice presidential debate. Of course, it seemed to be a totally different debate from the one between Harris and Trump, in that the two people seemed to be polite towards each other and were showing comedy and all sorts of other good things. And the first reaction was that Vance clearly won the debate, and that Waltz was a little bit more halting and stuttered and things like that. But then on the other hand, I mean, I also heard one commentator say that it was almost a draw. Maybe Vance was ahead on points, but then came the punch from Waltz towards the end of the debate when he asks about 2020. And Vance tries to evade the question, and he believed that knockout punch will look great, also because what we get afterward will be memes and short clips from the debate, and there will be ample stuff for the Democrats to point to. Also, the incredible answer by Vance that Trump salvaged Obamacare. Okay, that's enough on that.
Please, in our colleague. Who's got the mic? Over here, please. Why don't you start while the mic comes? We can hear you.
Yeah, but
well,
the audience can't.
While he's talking, please. Go ahead. Thank you.
All right, so this is old news, but after Dick Cheney, who was George W. Bush's vice president and really unpopular amongst Democrats back when he was vice president, he switched side this year and endorsed Kamala Harris. And what I'm curious about in that sense is, thank you, Sabine. And what I'm curious about is whether that is something that Republicans actually listen to and has an impact, or are other Republicans, are they just, far away with that generation of politicians? If that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Everybody in this room should know that children have an enormous impact on their parents, and that you can persuade your parents of a lot of things. And I think Liz Cheney's outspokenness against Trump influenced her father to make this decision. I think he doesn't trust Trump's foreign policy. He doesn't trust Trump. But I think his daughter gave him really pushed him over to do this. And yesterday, the Harris campaign clearly thinks that they can cut into the Republican vote. Not overwhelmingly. Most people who call themselves Republican will vote for Donald Trump. The question is, does she pick up 10% of the Republican vote, 12%, 15%? In a close election, that can make a big difference. And there were a lot of there's a whole bunch of Republican foreign policy aides who have endorsed Harris. There are the 3 former state Republican chair people of the Republican Party in Maine endorsed Harris. There's a bunch of this going on. And there's a very smart anti-Trump Republican pollster called Sarah Longwell, who talks a lot about creating permission structures for Republicans who really have never voted Cheney. Liz Cheney at a rally yesterday where the side of the back said country over party. She said she has never voted for a Democrat in her life. It's very hard for a lot of people on either side to cross over. And I think what they're trying to do is not win the whole Republican vote, but but chip away, and also independent people who are fairly conservative but don't really like Trump or might disagree with Harris. I think it's all about Sarah Longwell's permission structures. And we'll find out how much it works, but I think it's a smart strategy, and it's, I think, the most overt appeal for Republican votes since Lyndon Johnson against Barry Goldwater way back in 1964, when Goldwater was, though his character was far better than Donald Trump's, but he was a very, very conservative candidate. And there were a lot of Republicans who came out for Lyndon Johnson. I don't think I've seen in my lifetime as big an effort to get Republicans to switch as in this election. What do you think? Because I think some people are skeptical of how many will come over. I'm curious.
Sorry, I was just talking with Sabine, so I missed the final part of your comment. I'm sorry about that.
Oh no, just a question about Republicans for Trump.
Yeah. The thing is, we have to. Yeah. The thing is that we have to have maybe one final comment, and then we have to move on, have a break, and then move on to the next section of our arrangement, where we'll have 3 people from the United States talking.
I mean, it's because there's one.
Oh, can we get 2? Because I want this lady, this woman over here.
Okay, of course.
Why don't we get both of you in? Thank you so much. Why don't you start? And the mic, just bring the mic over here. But you can start. Thank you. Bless you. Thank you.
Yes. As a Danish person following American politics, I think one of the most terrifying things for me to follow is the whole talk about if Trump wins, is he the whole threat about pulling out of NATO, or how is that going to affect everybody else in the world, basically, and definitely us here in Europe? From your point of view and from what you know about the political landscape and the GOP and everything else, is that a big talk, or is that something that we should, in fact, be terrified about?
That's an excellent question, unfortunately.
Mine was similar, so just go with that one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I could jump in.
Yeah.
I think, the North Atlantic Alliance, which is really what it is, Canada, the United States, and Canada needs to be added to this equation, and Europe. I think it would be very hard for Trump to actually, destroy NATO, so to speak. I think he could weaken it, denigrate it, treat it flippantly, and so forth. But I think the U.S. Foreign policy establishment would be a very a tough thing for him to actually pull off, where he literally pulls the United States out of NATO. He nevertheless could weaken it to such a point, and he could cause a lot of damage by, winking and nodding at President Truman at Putin, and allowing the situation in Ukraine to deteriorate or come up with some kind of unjust peace, which would make NATO appear ineffective in the world, which would be also very damaging. I don't think he could get us completely out. I don't know, you may not agree, but that's kind of where I come down on that question.
I'm as worried as your question implies. I think the problem with Trump is you can never really be certain what he believes deep down on almost anything. And I suppose that sounds like a partisan statement, which I suppose it is, but I actually think that is a factually grounded statement. I mean, if you look at how he's flipped around on abortion in the last year, looking at the polls, and there are a lot of other issues except for immigration, where he's been willing to adjust. So I think we can't tell for certain. There is something to what David says that actually pushing through a program of like pulling out of NATO would be very hard. And there's at least, I would say, more than half of the Republican Party in Congress opposes this foreign policy. And Congress did, against Trump's wishes, pass a lot more aid to NATO, and Trump's close supporter, the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, actually eventually put it on the floor to get the aid to NATO. Still, I am very worried about a second Trump term, because I don't think I think there were a lot of people in the Trump administration in the first term who really pushed back hard to protect NATO, protect the Atlantic Alliance, and I worry a lot about who will serve in the next Trump administration, and I think it will be a much more hardline administration. And the way Trump talks about Putin or Orban or some other folks in the world is in itself, and Kim Jong-un in North Korea, for goodness sake, I think that is very, very disconcerting. And so I think we don't know.
No.
David's right, it won't be easy, but I think this will be more radical than the last Trump administration. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So we have to end this section now, but I'll just say very quickly that I participated in a couple of meetings with some former Danish diplomats and things like that, and they were not worrying about Trump destroying NATO, even though they did think that he would try to apply maximum pressure on European allies. Again, no one knows, of course, and things are more worrisome, as you point out. But thank you everyone for this section here, and we're going to move on. We'll take a little break now so that people can set up the next section, which begins at about 1:45, and so in like 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for your Virginia is for Lovers shirt. It's one of the great advertising slogans. Thank you.